Okay, welcome to this remote meeting of the Local Plan Working Group on Tuesday the 16th of March 2021. I was recommended for the housekeeping bit where we used to tell people to switch off our mobile phones, but I expect these days it's not really sure what people are doing, so it's mobile phones, iPads, televisions, making sure family members have been warned not to come wandering across the back of the screen. So whatever housekeeping is you need to do to make sure you're ready for the meeting, to go ahead and do that. Item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Do I have any declarations of interest? I'm seeing nobody indicating, which means I'll go on to item 2 on the agenda, which is the minutes of the meeting of the 20th of October of last year. Everybody happy that I can sign those as the correct record next time I'm in West offices? I'm seeing general nod and a little bit of waving. Item 3 then is public participation. We have one member of the public registered to speak today. It's Councillor Christian Vassi, and I will invite Councillor Vassi to enter the room now. Can you hear me?
Hello, yes.
You have approximately 3 minutes. You are the only public speaker, so I will give some leeway, but if it gets to 20 minutes, I will probably start to mute you.
Okay, well, I'm hoping it's 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Thank you, Chair. I understand that you'll soon be looking at the local plan in the context of special planning documents and climate change. As Chair of the Climate Change Committee here are some ideas. The City Council is developing a zero carbon pathway for York and will soon, I hope, be committing to delivering a zero carbon council by 2030. We all know that's a huge challenge. We also know the City Council cannot do climate change to the city. We have to work with the city, show leadership, inspire others, and create a framework in which change will be delivered. Our local plan is key, but as of now is weak on this subject. Going forwards, we need to make full use of special planning documents to cut emissions from heating and transport, to protect biodiversity, and to steer groups like the new Climate Commission, developers, planners, businesses, and residents alike. To know what these new SPDs could do, we can look to best practice elsewhere. And last month, Chair, you'll know I sent you and Assistant Director Mike Slater links to South Worcestershire's 2018 Low Carbon Energy SPD and drew your attention to Brighton and Hove's Community Food Growing SPD. We need to require new buildings do more than reduce energy consumption by 30% compared with previous standards. Other councils are doing this, but we need the planning framework to do it. And without it, we can't deliver a zero carbon York. Some local authorities are using SPDs to transform the energy efficiency of new buildings, domestic and commercial, imposing Section 106 payments on developers who fail to meet the council standards. For every tonne of extra CO2 a proposed development emits a year in those local authorities, a payment is paid, with those monies used to retrofit other buildings. So it is that year on year, every new development contributes directly or indirectly to the local authority's carbon reduction target. This isn't a dream. We're lucky it already happens in other local authorities. Secondly, I think we need an SPD linked to a map of local energy potential. Such a GIS map will list all low carbon and renewable energy resources across the local authority: wind, solar, water, heat pumps, geothermal, energy from waste, and more. The SPD can then require developers and planners to demonstrate that they're using local low-carbon energy to reduce the carbon footprint of their proposal. There's much more, of course. Energy-efficient households and buildings will achieve nothing if all we do is create disposable income for households to spend on more shopping and travel. Though, of course, I recognise that there are people in fuel poverty who won't get any benefit of that kind. Derwentthorpe is a big red warning sign on the pitfall of just creating buildings that are more efficient without thinking on a bigger scale. Our local plan needs a bold vision for a new local and low-carbon leisure opportunity for residents as well. In our twin city of Dijon, for example, they've got a new lake with beaches, campsites, cycling, nature trails, cafes, and sporting opportunities so that local residents can enjoy a low carbon grand day out closer to home. So a local plan can bring holistic thinking to shape our low carbon future. I trust we will resource the production of these SPDs so that our local plan helps to deliver our zero carbon York. Change won't happen by itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Vassy, and you're more than welcome to continue to watch the rest of the meeting on the live webcast.
Thanks.
In response to Christian Vassy, before I move on to agenda item 4, I was just going to invite one of our developers, Alison Cook, to just give an update on some of the comments that Councillor Vassy had made.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In relation to the policies in the local plan, obviously the local plan was submitted in May 2018, supported by an evidence base developed to support the policies in the plan. So there is evidence written by the Carbon Trust that supports the plan at the moment, and a previously renewable energy evidence base that does start to look at how we deliver renewable energy across the city and has influenced the way that we've set out the policies in the plan. I can assure you that at that moment in time, the plan was as ambitious as we were allowed to take it in planning policy terms. But as you know and are aware, members attributed funds to taking forward a climate change supplementary planning document. That supplementary planning document is being prepared and will be brought before members hopefully soon. And as part of that, we are considering all different issues that contribute to climate change so that those can be addressed through the planning system consistently and clearly. Following that will be out to consultation. So there will be a process by which a citywide consultation for 6 weeks will happen, and members and as well as the public will be able to contribute to that. So I would like to just reassure really that we are aware of those issues, and we'd like to encourage and support the agenda for climate change as much as possible.
Thank you, Alison. I was momentarily distracted by Councillor Taylor, who's taken us on a sort of a 1980s music video tour around his house. Do you want to just give him a minute, Councillor Taylor, before you get settled? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll move on to agenda item 4 then, which is the York Local Plan update, and I'll hand over to Mike Slater to introduce.
So, thank you, Chair. So good afternoon, members. Mike Slater, Assistant Director for Planning and Public Protection. Just before I move on to the local plan, just to reiterate what Alison said about the importance of SPDs, and Councillor Vassy said about the importance of SPDs. Clearly, though, they gather weight once you have a local plan. Before that, they become interim planning statements, and they don't have the same weight and force. So, as this committee will know, we have a big long shopping list of SPDs that we need to do work on, and there's probably more to add to that as we progress the local plan. In terms of the local plan, then the report before you sets out the position of the work that's been undertaken between our last report back in October and right up to date. And I'll ask Alison in a few minutes just to come in to talk about some of the next steps. Just wanted to take this opportunity just to reflect and remind you that back in October, we explained what we had done and some of the difficulties and some frustrations I think everyone in the process had during the situation of COVID over the last 12 months, that things were taking a little longer than expected. Certainly the work on the habitat regulation assessment and all the work that was fairly complicated around Strensall Common and involving other organisations took far longer than we'd anticipated, with lack of availability of certain people for all sorts of sort of personal and professional reasons. We have made though sort of good progress. Obviously we've dealt with the things the inspectors asked us to do, and some extra things that came up last year, particularly on the changes in the housing needs update. In terms of more recent matters, then there's been quite a lot of correspondence exchanges between ourselves and the inspectors around the Christmas period, and it was unfortunate that some things, pretty much emails almost crossed in the post, and then either we weren't available or the inspectors were on holiday. So the communication sort of fell down a little bit over that period, but I'm confident that we're in a position now where we're able to get correspondence between each party dealt with fairly swiftly. And before I bring in Alison, obviously the most recent letter from the inspectors is very positive in terms of accepting the additional work that needs to be done in terms of the Greenbelt details and agreeing our timetable for that, and setting out, as they have done, the start of the arrangements for virtual hearings and consultation. And we've been following that up to try and get those virtual hearings and the mechanisms in place for that. We don't envisage that we're likely to be probably back at the racecourse again. So on that point, I'll hand over to Alison just to talk through some of the main aspects of the report in terms of particularly the going forward and the work that we've got to still do just to finish off what I would call the Greenbelt homework. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So I've tried to set out in detail in the report, so I'll just go through a quick summary. But I think at a last update in October, we said that the habitat regulation assessment was completed but had not yet been signed off by Natural England. A key point is that Natural England are satisfied with the outcomes of that work, which is really positive, and that their response has been submitted to the inspectors. That means that the recommendations set out in the habitat regulation assessment should be are proposed to the inspectors as modifications and need to be accepted in order for the report to be legally compliant. So there are some key changes in there, including a new policy for strengths or common to add weight and security to the protection of the special area of protection, special area of conservation that it's as it's designated. In terms of that as well, our December submission included some updates resulting from the phase 1 hearings that were agreed by the inspector, such as a revised key diagram. The key diagram is meant to set out spatially in the main report itself just the strategic policies in the local plan. What the inspectors wanted us to show a bit more clearly was around the delineation of different parcels of land. So we've now tried to make a distinction between strategic employment sites, for example, and strategic housing sites, mixed use sites across the city, as well as some of the key infrastructure we've included as set out in the policies. In January, we submitted the Greenbelt technical paper addendum. As you know, the inspectors wrote to us last June setting out some of their concerns around the complexity of the methodology. This report now sets out more simply, albeit slightly longer, our response to those concerns raised by the inspectors, and also as a result of some of the issues that they raised with us. So, for example, the inspectors clarified to us their thoughts on the RSS saved policies pertaining to Greenbelt, and for example, the fact that we don't need to demonstrate exceptional circumstances in the process to meet our needs. We need to put the boundaries around the needs that we need, around sites that we need to that are needed for development to meet our needs in the future. So on that basis, we've gone through and developed that methodology and clarified those points. And the two key things that we've identified in that is the overarching, I guess, strategic points that we have dealt with. So, for example, we all accept that the RSS safe policies set the general extent of York's Greenbelt to 6 miles as a strategic point. We all accept that purpose 4 of the Greenbelt, to retain the historic setting of the town of York as a historic town, is one of the key principles of setting our Greenbelt. And then we go on to set out a more detailed methodology. So the inspectors were identified that they wanted more clarity around the questions, for example, of what we'd asked ourselves and how we went about that. We've now clarified those questions in section 8 of the methodology, and being very clear about the process that officers are going through in terms of how we're addressing each of the Greenbelt purposes. As Mike said, the latest correspondence sets out a timetable for submitting the Greenbelt annexes. Now that that methodology has been put in place, unfortunately, we weren't able to submit all the annexes at that time, but there's a number of annexes we need to complete that set out the detailed justifications for each of the boundaries we've identified. So, for example, we'll be looking at the inner boundaries. We'll be looking at all the villages and the other urban areas within that are inset from the Greenbelt across the local authority area. We'll be looking at standalone settlements, and we'll be looking at those villages that are within or washed over, if you like, in terms of green belts. And that detail will be submitted and has been agreed in terms of a timetable for some submissions at the end of this month and some the remaining submissions by the end of April. What we see in those pro formas is the translation of that methodology in detail to provide that detailed justification. So that is a change from how we previously presented it, and it's all to do with the clarity of the presentation of the report, which we think will be strong and robust when we get round the table to discuss individual boundaries. Thank you, Chair. I think that's all summarised from my perspective. Happy to take questions, obviously.
Okay, thank you, Alison. I'll open up to members. Any questions? Councillor Doughty.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, if I may. First one relating to the habitat regulation assessment, which is detailed in pages 8 to 10. I note that Natural England have concurred with the conclusions within the assessment the council's made. Has there been any indication at all from inspectors with a view to the suggestion of removal of sites in Strensall, and indeed what might happen, or has the council considered or had discussions with the Defence Infrastructure Organisation as to what might happen when they leave the developed land aspects of the site?
In terms of indications from the inspectors with regards to the acceptance of the proposals, we haven't yet. What we've had is a confirmation from the inspectors that the report needs to be consulted on, and it will be out to citywide consultation, and the proposals will then be considered in public and again at the next hearing sessions. What I would say is that the habitat regulation assessment is a document that pertains to legal compliance of the plan. So there's two stages against which the plan is assessed, either legal compliance legal compliance and soundness. Legal compliance, we must be legally compliant in order to proceed with the plan, and the recommendations therefore from the habitat regulation assessment should be accepted in order to proceed to be legally compliant in terms of the plan. So I would my view is that those proposals will be accepted by the examiners. However, what the examiners have inspectors have also asked us to do is to work with the Defence Infrastructure Organisation on a statement of common ground with Natural England. Those conversations are ongoing, and it's our intention to have that formulated and submitted as part of the examination process. Clearly, we all have different views on the outcomes of that report, so but it will be interesting to have that in for discussion with the inspectors. But what that will do is highlight those areas of common ground and those areas that we are uncommon ground, essentially, which the debate, I would say, at the next session will focus on. In terms of what would happen from the DIO's perspective, if it wasn't taken forward as an allocation, that hasn't yet been a conversation I'm aware of that has taken place or been agreed to in terms of the barracks and how they were taken forward.
Okay, from a personal point of view, obviously, and residents in Strensall would be concerned to see a site just abandoned. We've experienced elements of vandalism, etc., on sites that have been left in the past, and that would cause a concern. So it is a priority, I think, those discussions. Thank you. And one other question, if I may, Chair, or I'm happy to take other other members' questions first, if you want to come back to me.
You have the floor, Councillor Doughty, go for it. Right,
thank you. Can officers, in a summary form, tell us how they're evidencing and keeping the local plan up to date for inspectors, and how are they addressing inspector concerns about future delays?
I can come in here, Chair, if I may. In terms of keeping the local plan up to date, then obviously through the whole examination process, we've been receiving requests from inspectors for information. And in some of the correspondence you'll see it's been referenced, the information that we have sent them. There has been an awful lot of correspondence over the last sort of 12 months in terms of that, and we'll continue that dialogue with the inspectors to make sure they have the information that they feel is appropriate. As Alison said, a part of that will be a further consultation to get people's input onto the proposals and the information that's been submitted to them over the last 12 months. In terms of ongoing on the timetable, then at the moment, in terms of the Greenbelt annexes, it was something that we hadn't envisaged that we would need originally to revisit at this stage. We recognize, in terms of the boundaries, we recognize that at sometime in the process, there's going to be people wanting to challenge many of the boundaries around the city, around the villages, and around some of the allocations. But it's something that we felt would be likely to be at a later stage of the whole examination process. So we're sort of doing that work earlier perhaps than expected. And it's quite a labour intensive piece of work. You know, there are hundreds of kilometres of boundaries, and each one then has to be is sort of categorised and justified in detail. And as Alison has explained earlier, we're simplifying that to make it clear to the inspectors how we've come to the decisions that are in the plan as submitted. We are aware that we've got a timetable that we need to meet, and we're deploying sort of resources within the council with some external help as well on the Greenbelt annexes to make sure that we can meet those deadlines. Thank you.
Councillor Douglas, are you indicating on this particular point? Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to ask a further question on the delays. I think we all know that this is getting increasingly important, that we move this whole process forward very rapidly, and as local developers are chomping at the bit to start developing on the outer edges of York without a local plan in place, which would be severely detrimental to the whole city. So, Mike, I just wanted to ask you about that resourcing and whether it's sufficient to get us where we need to be in the time frame that we've got. And I'm just wondering about where we've gone with resources. So when the plan was submitted in May 2018, I assume then that the team actually was reduced to what was a working kind of team rather than a submission team. And can you tell me what was thought to be suitable for the size of that team to carry on with the progress of the plan?
I haven't got all the numbers. Obviously, over a long period for York's work on a local plan, there's been fluctuations in the size of the team. Just at the moment, for example, there's a bulge of work that's required on the Greenbelt annexes. So we recognise that if it was just the team to deal with it, it would take an unacceptably long period. So we have some development management officers who only work part-time and doing extra hours to work on the Greenbelt. We have some external planning inputs to that process as well. So we've always had a situation where there's been flexes within the team, and the core team has been supplemented by people quite often work with York or external consultants. And obviously, as this committee will appreciate, not just on the general matters of the local plan, but some of the specialist inputs, whether it be ecology, highways, housing. We've had a whole range of sort of specialists. I don't have the numbers to hand in terms of that. I'm satisfied at the moment we have enough capacity to do what we're going to do in the short term. Alice and I have had discussions with Neil Ferris as corporate director to discuss what we need to take the plan forward, and we recognise again that as we get in towards the next phase of examination, we need to bring back in the external consultants who we're going to be asking to give evidence, and we probably need some extra capacity at various stages in that to prepare for the next phase of hearings and possibly, depending on the number of consultation responses we get, we may need some extra capacity there on a temporary basis, at least for that. And Alison can advise, previously on consultations, we've used one of the big planning consultants to help us do the analysis and the tabulation of those responses to prepare them for the inspectors. So it's one of those things where there are sort of peaks and troughs. We still have some vacancies within the team, and we're looking to hopefully to recruit to those vacancies so we can get the permanent team up to speed in terms of its capacity. But it's something that will fluctuate at the different stages of the process.
I think it's fair to say as well, Mike, it's not just resourcing within the team. A lot of this work is done with external partners, and it's what level of resources they have, for example, Match England, etc., at the same time. So it's not just dependent on the council's own resources in terms of some of these submissions. Councillor Douglas, is that again a follow-up on this particular point? Because Councillor Crawshaw has been very patient.
Yeah, it is a follow-up to the resourcing. So I think I understand that the team was at one point around 14 people and it is currently around 6. And so how many vacancies have you got, Mike, at the moment?
We've probably got 2 or 3 vacancies in there, but there's some people on temporary arrangements acting up, doing extra hours, so it gets really quite complicated. Alison at the moment is sort of temporarily acting up from a different role, but we've got other colleagues who have had extensions of their contracts, their hours, to increase from full-time to almost, some part-time to almost full-time. I can ask Alison just to come in on the staffing numbers, perhaps.
Yeah, of course. There are currently 4 vacancies in the team, as far as I'm aware. But clearly, I mean, obviously we're talking about local plan here today, but clearly the remit of the team is wider than the local plan. So we've also got competing elements in terms of priorities. Clearly, the local plan is priority, but clearly we're also progressing SPDs, the minerals and waste local plan, neighbourhood planning, which will obviously come on later into this meeting as well. So those resources are split across those areas of strategic planning policy.
It's probably also reflecting as well that the budget has never been reduced for that particular area, so the budget remains the same. It's not a resourcing issue, it's often a personnel issue. Councillor Taylor was slightly before you on this point. If it was a follow-up to that point, Councillor Taylor.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I note the use of the word currently when we're describing the number of vacancies in the core team. We're not expecting any more vacancies in the core team, are we?
It's an impossible question to answer, Councillor Taylor. Everybody works in a situation. You can't forecast whether anybody will find
it depends on who knows what.
I'm going to move on to Councillor Douglas.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think Councillor Taylor's point is valid, because we might have certain numbers of vacancies now, and we might know that another one is coming or 2 is coming, and I think it's a reasonable question. So it would be helpful if that could be answered. But I just wanted to add on to that, whether Mike and Alison feel that they can actually hire into these positions, or are you on a hiring freeze as well? And is that going to impact your ability to meet the timeframes that have been laid out for you in the timetable? Thank you.
We can move forward. I think we have some job descriptions that just need sort of refreshing, and in the past we've had some specialist posts that we perhaps don't need to hire as a specialist. They may be sort of generalists. So for example, we've had in the team for a number of years an officer who was a lead on sort of transport planning, and the job description is in that. We think we need to probably recruit somebody who's not a general planner, but a planner that can deal with all aspects of not just a local plan, but the other work in the team as well, which is important. We're touching tonight on neighbourhood plans and SPDs, but the team covers much more than the local plan.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair, and it's fine to wait. I was quite happy to let everybody ask questions. My question is actually sort of related as well to the process around meeting the inspectors' requirements. I just wanted to note as well, whilst it's really helpful to have the inspector's letter from, I think it's March, published as an annex to this, it would have been helpful, I think, to have all of the inspector's letters since the last update, because I've had to go back and have a look to find them. I just want to ask a question relating to what the discussion that's been had, and then a second question, if I may, just on an earlier letter from the inspector. So we've set out a process now and a time frame, and I think there's a 30th of April deadline. Mike, you said that the letter from the inspector was positive from March. I read it a little bit differently. I read it as being a bit impatient, actually, and in the sort of last 2 or 3 paragraphs, it does seem to set out, you know, if further delays beyond this timetable you've put forward do occur, we will need to review our position on whether or not there's a reasonable chance that the examination could progress to a positive outcome. That doesn't necessarily read positively. That reads as this is the last ultimatum, you must meet this 30th of April deadline. And so I suppose what I'm looking for is just some reassurance from you that that 30th of April deadline will be met, and whether or not you foresee any threats on the horizon to actually meeting that deadline. Were the deadline to be missed, could you just set out what the implication might be, what the inspector could choose to do if that deadline was not met?
I mean, I think it's the glass half full or glass half empty, really. I was taking the positives. Clearly, the inspectors are here to help us and want the plan to move forward, as we all do, I think, in this meeting. In terms of the measures, I've explained some of the extra staffing measures that we've put in terms of development management officers, the team, and some external consultants helping us with the local plan work. So at this time, we're reasonably comfortable that we can meet that time scale. In terms of what happens if we don't meet that time scale, well, we'd like to think, rather like, you know, the government doing a vaccination program, we'd like to think we actually get ahead of the game and submit things earlier, but time will tell on that. If we don't, I guess it depends, you know, if you're a day late, then what's going to happen? Possibly not a great deal. If we said we needed another number of weeks or months, then I guess the inspectors would have to come to a view on that. I think the positives here are that, you know, we have been submitting work, not just the overall methodology that Alison has referred to and is referred to in the documents that you have, but we've been doing the work on the annexes, and they've seen that. They've made no comment that they think there's any problem with the methodology as represented to them and the work in the annexes. And as you see from the timetable, you know, we are going to drip feed them information as we deal with different sections of the Greenbelt boundaries. And I guess at any time, if they really are concerned about what's coming forward and what they're receiving, then they will say that. And they haven't done that. And on that basis, it is quite positive. And our conversations, you know, with the programme officer have been moving forward into consultation in the city, and then moving forward into virtual hearings. So our discussions are more about Microsoft Teams and Zoom arrangements going forward. In terms of not meeting the deadline, well, again, it depends on what the issue is. If we were to say there's a real problem here and we're going to be weeks or months away from that timescale, then I guess the inspectors will have to take a view on that. At the end of the day, you know, the local plan processes, whether we like it or not, are extremely lengthy, and York's isn't taking particularly longer than many other authorities across the country, and many people have experienced issues over the last 12 months for all those practical reasons that we understand. I hope that's probably answered the question, or have I missed a point? There's a few points that you made, Councillor Crenshaw.
Thanks, Mike. I think that covers most of it, but I think if I may sort of take it on to the second question, Chair, which is kind of related. The letter that was received from the inspector in December, which I'm sorry to refer to because it's not in the papers, but as I say, I think it would have been helpful, talks about the inability to approve an up-to-date plan the longer that this process goes on, because so much of the information that was submitted was already quite old at the time that it was submitted. And indeed, I think there's reference made to things being up to a decade old, which presumably is a reflection of the lengthy ongoing churn that there has been with the local plan in York in particular. I guess what I'm wondering, and again, this is more about process than it is about content, particularly of the stuff. But first of all, is it usual for data to be submitted with a local plan, presumably a couple of years ago now, that was already at that point 6, 7, 8 years out of date? And how much further, if this does delay a month or two beyond April, where is the point at which more and more of the data that was submitted, which possibly was 4, 5, 6 years old, starts to become less and less credible because this whole process is taking so long? So it's not so much about submitting the data that we have currently that we need to add, but the data that we've already submitted that's sort of teetering on the edge of being out of date. Does more and more of that become at risk?
Not necessarily, because it depends what it is. For example, so setting green belt boundaries isn't a time thing; it's a process and a methodology to set that. So that's not going out of date. In terms of things like housing, then we're constantly in a situation, aren't we, where pretty much every year there's either new population forecasts, household formation forecasts, stuff coming out from the ONS. So every authority faces those sorts of challenges and changes, and obviously we've addressed that during the course of last 12 months, and that wasn't on the inspector's original list. So things like that have been refreshed. We're confident that the employment position is up to date. A lot of the other policies, don't forget, in the plan aren't a time limit. They are about the city's aspirations or the council's aspirations for the city in terms of land use policies, development management policies to go forward. Clearly, I think for all authorities, the whole issue of COVID and the sort of response to COVID, and I'm guessing to some extent then the implications that might have on commercial development and retail development are things that everybody across the country is going to have to grasp. And I would think it may be that if we can progress with the local plan, sort of city centre, district centre policies may be some of the first things that people across the country will have to review. Alison, can I just ask if Alison wants to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Mike. So in terms of evidence, I think I understand the reference you're talking to. I was just looking it up on the letter, and I think it's a regrettable reference, really, because I know that we could say that was actually not the evidence that should be supporting the plan. It would be a different evidence that is a lot more up to date. But just to add to what Mike said, in terms of it is usual through an examination process that you're allowed to refresh and confirm evidence as we move through. So, for example, in the last hearing sessions, before the last hearing sessions, when we were talking about housing requirement, we recognised that there needed to be a refresh potentially of the employment forecasting, which Mike referred to, and that's been an accepted part of the evidence base as submitted. So we have actually put that into the examination, and people have been able to comment on that. So as we move through this, I think what we'll be looking at is we'll definitely be taking stock of some of those evidence bases that do refer to time limits. So as Mike said, we're confident that our employment evidence and our housing evidence is up to date, for example, and some of the other evidence bases, to do with landscape, or heritage, etc., the heritage topic paper, things like that, they have a lot more longevity against them, and that is recognised in the examination process. So we will be looking at that issue, and we did refer to it in our letter of the 15th of January that actually that approach has been acceptable thus far in the examination, and we hope that would be acceptable as we move through as well. So the inspectors haven't yet said that wouldn't be. I think they're just raising their concern that we need to keep an eye on that as we're moving through the process.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I guess just seeking your confirmation then, is what you're saying that you're comfortable that there isn't a risk that by the time that this gets over the line, it won't be out of date? Because I think that's my very summary reading of that December letter, is that the inspector's basically saying there's evidence here that's very old that we're referring to. So even if this got across the line, the danger is that by the time it's over the line, that the plan is out of date. And what you're saying is that you think you've got sufficient capacity to refresh everything such that at the point at which it crosses the line, it won't be an out of date plan.
Yes, in a nutshell. I mean, with the
Yes.
provisos that I've said, that the world has changed quite a lot over the last year, hasn't it? For all planning authorities, again, retail forecasting, retail, uses, and land uses, may be something that I think would be perhaps visited. But again, we can pick that up with the inspectors. They haven't flagged anything up yet, but clearly we can all see that potentially retail doesn't go back to quite what it was a year or so ago.
I think it's probably fair to say as well, isn't it, Mike, that no local plan is a static document, and it's as soon as it is approved, that is a starting point, and it's something that has to be reviewed on a regular basis anyway.
Yeah, and don't forget, inspectors in all local plans, the world moves, the local plan process, whether you like it or not, takes a long time, and the world sort of changed, doesn't it? I mean, just another example, and we haven't seen it back here yet, but, we haven't got an adopted minerals and waste plan yet, but that's been the subject of change as well. We had a situation where we've put forward what we think are some first-class policies to control shale gas exploration, and the inspector for that is generally supportive of that. But during the process of that, further evidence came forward, and some of you remember that watch these things. There's quite a lot of issues that took place off the Fylde coast that were seismic issues that were associated with shale gas exploration. And the inspector again, asked for more evidence about that and has looked at that. So, the local plan process isn't sort of set in a tablet of stone, that you can take account of things that happen in an external environment. And again, the housing forecasts and population forecasts, and I have to say, government assessments of housing needs methodology seem to change pretty much every year.
I think it was closer to home in Leeds that actually adopted a very high housing figure, and within about 2 years of the adoption of the local plan, had to revise their entire housing figure down and consult on taking significant sites out of the local plan. And that was in a couple of years of adoption. Councillor Fisher.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on what my fellow colleague said. He beat me to it by a fraction. It is about Strensall and the site of the Queen Elizabeth Barracks. This has caused a huge delay because of the decision to release it for housing originally by the government, put into the local plan, then consulted on, then taken out at the behest of Natural England and so on. The government were very clear. Michael Fallon, when he made the statement about the closure of the infrastructure, the Ministry of Defence estates, was very clear. The sites were to be released for housing. And he said specifically that it could release up to 50,000 houses. Now, my view is that the DIO are not going to give up on that, because they clearly want to realise the enormous amount of money that's tied up in these sites. And I can see ourselves coming into an arm wrestle between the DIO and Natural England. And Natural England wanted to protect Strensall Common, which is a SAC, and DIO want to realise the site. Now, should DIO win that, and we've put this restriction on, how do we deal with that? Can we deal with the site as a windfall site? Would it cause problems with the adoption of the local plan? The next point also, sorry, I'm having to read my notes now. My eyesight's pretty bad. If housing isn't permitted on that site, if it's taken out the site as a housing allocation, what can it be used for? What uses would be acceptable within that condition on page 11 of our documents, paragraph 13? Because the last thing we want is in 2024, when that site is closed, there is no use in place for it. It's the key site as you come in or out of Strensall. It's the key site, and if it goes into dereliction because the army wash their hands of it, it is going to be a blot on the landscape. We have got to think of what we can do with that site should it not be allocated for housing. And there has to be clear understanding that it will not go into dereliction, because my village will become blighted by it.
Councillor Fisher, Chair, if I can just come in there first of all before bringing Alison in, then I think unfortunately we are in a situation that we do have effectively a dispute with the defence organisation over the site. They will pursue this obviously through the examination process, and one would hope that that will give us a clear steer on this. And if they weren't to satisfy the appointed inspectors on this, it's hard to see how they could satisfy a different inspector if they were to deal with it by a planning application and an appeal. So, now is the time for that sort of debate. In terms of then the future, then obviously there hasn't been any sort of meaningful discussion about what you do if they don't get permission for houses on the site. The one thing that has come out informally, though, is that it isn't the intention, I don't think, to give up the firing range, certainly in the short term. And they have sort of mentioned to us the potential need for more buildings, even though they're basically wanting to get rid of buildings and replace them with houses. Alison, do you want to just come in as well here, please?
Yeah, of course. So just to give a bit of detail around the decision that's been made around the proposed removal of the barracks, the reason that we're proposing that that site couldn't come forward was the scale of development adjacent to the boundary of Strensall Common. So the key vulnerability that we've identified through the HRA is the recreational pressure. So essentially, the closer people live to the site, the more people will use the site, the more trampling, damage, etc. would happen to the heathland. And therefore, the site would go into unfavourable condition as it proceeds, and that would be against the objectives of the designation of it being a special area of conservation. So we've looked at that. Now we've assessed the site on the basis of how we looked at it through the local plan in terms of the allocation, and as a result of the further information that the DIO submitted. When we had it as an allocation, for example, we had it as 500 homes on the main barrack site itself, and the DIO have come back with they're supporting 600 homes. As Mike said, this issue will be taken forward in terms of our outcomes, Natural England's opinion, and the DIO's objections to it, which is why our statement of common ground going to the next phase of hearings is really important, so we can almost isolate and pinpoint those issues that are needed for further discussion and debate, so the inspectors can come to an opinion and decision. Just picking up on your point, Councillor Fisher, in relation to what could happen on the site, essentially what we're saying, so for example, the site at E18, which is the employment part of the barracks off Towthorpe Lane, we've said is a suitable use, and we've retained it as an allocation. The reason being that actually an employment use, if the design of that makes sure that the site couldn't be used for recreational use, for example, at weekends. So, for example, it doesn't become a car park at weekends, and it's a closed site with gates, for example, that people can't park at and use as an additional access point. That should be a suitable use, subject to the design of the site and that location. So the uses we'd be expecting to come forward on those on this site would be something that wouldn't contribute to the recreational pressure on the common. That's the key problem that we've identified and key rationale behind removal of the allocation.
Do you want to come back on that, Councillor Fisher?
If I could, yes. I totally support your view on the view in the plan of Towthorpe Line. Towthorpe Line is entirely suitable for an employment site, and the medical group that work there now, the regiment that work there, are relocating. We know that. But you've hit the nail on the head about the use of the site, about the main barracks. The firing ranges are staying in place. They're still going to be used because all the other firing ranges in the north of England are at full capacity. So by closing this camp, what the meaning is that the cadets from Harrogate, who are the main user of the site, will have to be bussed over from Harrogate every day to use the site and then bussed back. Now, what is the logic in that? I mean, surely the whole point is that they need that site. There's also the issue that the Army Cadet Force own land on there and buildings on there, and they will be continuing to use it. So what we've seen here is a site that has been released, which is actually perfectly needed by the Army. And I'm sorry, but the military top brass have got to get their head around the fact that Strensall Barracks should be kept open. But we're left in a situation of having to deal with an issue which is not of our making, but it is a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. And if it does close, finding another use for it is not going to be easy.
I feel that question may be a little bit above Alison and Michael's pay scale, but I'm sure I'll pass it on to the top brass at the MOD in a very forceful manner. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. Fairly procedural question, and it comes back to this idea of our efforts and ability to to use the latest evidence in all of this. And I'm just wondering, am I right in thinking that the next household population projections from the ONS will probably be delayed because of the census rollout? Is that a thing, and is that on officers' radar?
If I can answer that, Chair, so the population projections and the household populations are usually undertaken every 2 years. So, for example, the 2018 based population projections were released in 2020. So I would anticipate that there would be a release in 2022. The census is obviously the most comprehensive database of information collected, and but usually there is a lag time. I would, in experience, there's usually a lag time in terms of the information being disseminated and released into the public domain. I understand that might be speeded up this time because obviously they're asking the majority of people to submit electronically, so the dissemination of information may happen quicker. But I don't think that would delay the response to the the population projections. What we might see is the population projections being released and then being updated based upon when the census information is actually being disaggregated.
From my recollection, Alison, the household formations generally come about 2 years after the population forecast. So the population forecast would generally take a year.
Yeah.
So the 21 data would be released normally probably in 22 and then would translate to household formations by 24. So the latest, which is one of the things that's always entertained me, the latest household figures we'll have will already be based on 2-year-old population projections anyway. So we'll be at least 3 to 4 years before the census data roll its way through, which is one of the joys of the latest figures.
Yes, that's my understanding too.
Councillor Pearson.
Cheers.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it was just to sort of ask the question as to if we were to be brave or foolish and withdraw the local plan, what impact would that actually have on housing numbers?
In terms of withdrawing the local plan, then we have planning by application and possibly by planning appeal. I can see I think there is hopefully a consensus in the city that we need a local plan and we need one as quickly as possible. I can't see that withdrawing the plan and having to start again on a long process has any benefit at all for the city, to be honest.
What's the current methodology that would be used for that plan, Mike?
Well, in terms of Alison can come in on it's a standard methodology for housing numbers.
It would be. So currently the plan is being taken through the examination process under transitional arrangements. So we submitted before the deadline of the implementation of the 2019 NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. So if we came out of examination and had to move forward with a new plan, we'd be subject to the government's standard methodology figure, which is currently over, I think, 1,000. The current figure, I think, that was released before Christmas, it's 1,026. There is a difference between the two methodologies. So, for example, at the moment, we identify our own objective assessed housing need and attribute a shortfall based upon the beginning of the examination of the plan process, which gets us to the 822 dwellings per annum that we support and continue to support as part of this examination. If we were taken out, then the standard methodology from the government is a forward-looking figure, but doesn't take into consideration, for example, it's very much population-based, affordability-based. It's adjusted by an affordability ratio, but doesn't take into consideration, for example, anything to do with our unique characteristics or something like that, which we would have to consider, I think, if we were to look at that again under that process. But as Mike says, we're very keen. We don't think there's any benefit in taking the plan out of examination at this stage. We think it's better to pursue to get to a plan under this examination.
paradox that as our population figures projections drop, our housing figure goes up from the government as they move houses from the south to the north. Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. It was just a slightly different and slightly tangential question, I appreciate, but I think it might just be helpful just to get the latest thinking. The government was consulting on global changes to the planning process, and I think that one of the things that was a possible implication of that was what would happen with local plans that were either partway through or completed and all the rest of it. And so obviously, you know, I think Mike, you said, you know, you hope there's a consensus about the need for a local plan, and I think that certainly is the case. You know, I don't think anybody thinks we shouldn't have a local plan. I think that the issue is about getting it right and making sure it's appropriate, and you know, I think that's what we're all hoping to achieve. But I just wondered if you could give us any latest information, any possible nuggets that you might have picked up from anybody about where things are in terms of that planning white paper that was promised, and any changes and any potential risks where we are currently within our local plan process, and whether or not there's any possibility of government kind of coming in and taking it out of our hands from that perspective, notwithstanding anything that's happening with the inspectors.
I don't think there's anything, if I can come in to start, I don't think there's anything from MHCLG to suggest there's an issue. Clearly, there's a whole raft of planning reforms coming through, from permitted development rights to potentially sort of new simplified local plans. I'll bring Alison in a minute in terms of the timescale for that. There's no indication from the inspectors dealing with our plan that they think, you know, we need to be doing a new style plan with sort of simplified zoning process. That's going to take some time to come in. And I think, and Alison can correct me if I got this wrong, I think it may require some sort of primary legislation changes. And I guess at the moment, that's possibly quite a long way down, you know, the government's list of priorities for parliamentary time. So that's not on the horizon. It's not been mentioned by the inspectors that are dealing with our plan. And when they're talking about our evidence base, there's no indication that that's what they're referring to. Alison, perhaps you can assist here as well.
Yeah, of course. So the consultation that was released, they did say that there'd be transitional arrangements in place for those authorities that were, you know, in the process or had just finished the process, which meant that I think they would be allowing authorities to continue to get their plan under the examination process in place, and then following that there would be a longer time frame for that authority to work in terms of getting their plan together in the new style. So there was certainly some allowances for those plans that were really advanced or had just been adopted, that they needed to be in place, and then there'd be more time to look at it. But in terms of what Mike's saying, yeah, I think there's the impression we get is that this is going to be replacing the Town and Country Planning Act sort of wholesale, because it is a new style of they see it as a new style of planning. In terms of some of the things coming through that, I think we are expecting legislative, you know, huge changes in the legislative framework, which will take some time to be ratified through the process. What the government is showing us at the moment is some incremental changes that they're doing in the background. So, for example, they've already implemented changes to land use classifications. They're consulting at the moment, for example, on slight changes to the MPPF 2019, which might be brought in. So they're already starting to pull some of those things into consultation at the moment, but we haven't been given a clear timetable, I would say, in terms of when their new vision for a planning system would be fully implemented on that new legislative basis.
Thank you.
I think from the conversations I've had and the noise I've had, Alison, it tends to be around delivery against plan targets seems to be the main focus of pressure on the plans. And so actually getting that figure in and agreed, it would then be the government monitoring over a 2 to 3 year period to make sure that you are delivering against that target that you've set, putting pressure on those local authorities that aren't.
That's correct, yeah.
I was typing a message to Callum Taylor. Was it an actual question, or was it a question that you've mentioned to me privately?
It's a question, sorry, Chair.
Okay, go ahead, Callum.
Even though I am bursting for the toilet, I do want to ask the question. Yeah, not to sort of complicate things further, but how does local government reorganisation fit into all of this? And does this just sort of throw all of that up into the air? Looking at some of the reactions there is quite interesting. Or is it simply a case that we can roughly, neatly slot in with whoever we are thrown in with or not thrown in with at the end of it all?
I can come in here. I think we carry on with our plan for York. These things happen externally, don't they? And have done across the country. I worked in Cheshire before coming over to this side of the Pennines, and that was reorganised from a lot of districts and a county council into sort of Cheshire, Eastern Cheshire, West. It's happened in Northumberland. It's happened in Durham. So what you would find, Councillor Taylor, is a new authority, if there was a new authority, would I suspect when it came to sort of plan review, look at the collective plans for their area, which are probably made up of different district or unitary authorities plans. So that's when it would happen, I think. You'd come together perhaps then for renew or refresh of a plan, but cover a larger administrative area. So I think we're some way off that for York at the moment.
Okay, do I have any further questions or comments? Councillor Fisher.
Just to shed some light on that last point, there was a fully prepared and examined Southern Rydale local plan in place in 1995, ready to be adopted. Local government reorganisation came around, it was binned. And that tends to be what happens to local plans, especially if you get an area which is part of a new area. Very often the council decides not to adopt. So that's what happened in 1995.
Councillor, I'll come to everyone. I think we've done very well there, Councillor Fisher, to do a history of the local plan and only go back to 1995, not 1954. But I will now go to Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Chair. Well, you never know. A similar thing could happen again. If York was put in with Rydale, Scarborough and Selby, much bigger administrative area, we might even get talk of new towns in between the main cities, which may well take the pressure off York for development. And I'm sure we're all aware of the, how should we put it, the very capable forward planning team at Selby. We'd no doubt be reacquainting ourselves with some very familiar faces there. Thank you, Chair.
Any further questions or comments on this particular item? Okay, I'll just make some brief comments in terms of what's happening. I think the answer to Councillor Pearson's question was very clear in terms of what would happen if we were to withdraw the plan. I think we do go to standard methodology and our housing figures go through the roof to a level that the city has never been anywhere close to delivering. I think thank officers for the hard work they've done in what has been a very difficult time and a very challenging time for the team, and really appreciate the work they've done. We always know, I think I was told a long time ago, that the special character, the unique nature of York's Greenbelt is something that was added to the policy situation, often particularly around York. It's something that's very untested and very untried, and it was always going to be a challenging moment to have that conversation with the planning inspector about where those final boundaries are. And as much as we laugh about the last 40 or 50 years, that's how long it has taken to get to some level of agreement about where the inner Greenbelt boundaries are. And I think it was never going to be an easy win that we would just submit something and everybody would say, well, you know what, after 60 years, you've absolutely nailed that, bang on the head, well done. So I think we always saw that challenge coming. As Mike said earlier, I think we probably expected it to come a little bit later down the planning process than it did, but we're there, and I think we've got a robust case that we can defend with that one. So I think with that, we have a recommendations to go through on, to just note the paper really on paragraph 2 on page 7. Are we happy to note the recommendations? Take that one as agreement. Okay, thank you very much. Now I have had a request that we take a short 5-minute refreshment break. I was stalling a little bit there with my speech as I wasn't entirely sure how we did it, but I've been assured that we can actually do it. I did say yes, Callum, but I wasn't sure as actually how we did it. So I've been assured now, just the last minute, we can do that. So we'll take a short adjournment of the meeting and we'll return at 6:10. That's okay. Okay, welcome back to this meeting of the Local Plan Working Group. We'll go to the last item on the agenda, which is item 5, the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan. And I'll hand over to Mike Slater again to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. It wouldn't be a Local Plan Working Group without an update on the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan, I think. Anna's is online and is going to join us to talk through this, and it's another good news item, I think.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, this report does relate to the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan. The Huntington Neighbourhood Plan has concluded its examination. We've now received the examiner's report, which is Annex A. We have also held an additional consultation on proposed additional modifications in relation to greenbelt policies, which are set out at Annex B. Firstly, though, I would like to just say thank you, and we really appreciate the amount of hard work and dedication that Huntington Parish Council has put into the process to produce a locally representative document detailing issues within the Huntington Parish. In terms of the examiner's report, we received this in February last year, and overall the examiner recommends to the council that, subject to the incorporation of his proposed modifications set out in his report, that the Huntington Plan should proceed to referendum. The examiner's report includes a series of modifications. These are all set out in Annex D, which is the decision statement. The majority of the examiner's modifications were minor in nature. He did, however, make a few recommendations which are set out in paragraphs 18 to 26 of my Local Plan Working Group report, predominantly to ensure that there was consistency with the local plan and also national policy. Officers are content with the examiner's recommendations. In terms of the additional recommendations the officers put forward in terms of the Greenbelt, members will recall that officers did bring a paper on this back in October last year, and officers recommended modifications based upon the receipt of the High Court judgment, which was Wedgwood against the City of York Council, which clarified how to make decisions on whether to treat land as falling within the Greenbelt for development management purposes in advance of the adoption of the local plan. Annex B and Annex D set out the proposed additional recommendations, some more, and the consultation comments that we received to the consultation were predominantly supportive, and the officers continue to recommend these changes. In terms of the decision statement, the legislation requires the council to consider each of the recommendations made by the examiner and also the additional officer recommendations as set out in Annex D and decide what action to take. It's recommended that all of the examiner's recommended modifications, apart from his Greenbelt modifications, and also the additional officer modifications in relation to Greenbelt, should be made. The officer recommendation is that, subject to these modifications, the plan meets the basic conditions, is compatible with the convention rights, and also complies with the provisions that can be made by a neighbourhood plan. If the local authority is satisfied that the neighbourhood plan meets the basic conditions and complies with the definition of a neighbourhood plan, if it was to be modified, then a referendum must be held. The council must publish its decision in a decision statement, which is Annex D, and hold a referendum within 56 days. If the executive agreed to the proposed amendments to the decision statement, then the neighbourhood plan would hold significant weight when it comes to planning applications. Members of the working group are asked to recommend this approach to the executive in order to proceed. So just quickly, just to go through next steps, the decision on whether to hold a referendum will be made executive on this Thursday, which is the 18th of March. Assuming that executive do endorse the recommendations in the report, it's anticipated the referendum would be held on or before the 10th of June this year. And that's within the 56-day period which the regulations set out. The specific date is still being considered and consulted on with colleagues in electoral services. The neighbourhood plan regulations then state within 8 weeks following the referendum, the plan would need to be made or adopted. That is also an executive function. So that report would have to come back to the local plan working group and to executive again in July of this year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anna. I think, as Mike said, this has felt like a standing agenda item, and for those of us who are on the executive, we get the pleasure of the deja vu often a week after we've had this particular one. But I'll go to questions first. Councillor Roll.
It's just comments, Chair, no questions. First of all, I perhaps should declare that I'm a member of Huntington Parish Council, but it's not a prejudicial interest and certainly not a pecuniary interest. First, I'd like to confirm what's said about the people on Huntington Parish who've prepared this plan. I've been watching them for probably 6 or 7 years doing the work for this, and I think I should single out one person in particular who's done the vast majority of work for this, who's the chair of the planning on Huntington Parish Council, Councillor David Joblin. His work on this has been exemplary and very, very time consuming for him and for the rest of the group. It's good that the Greenbelt aspects of the neighbourhood plan have now been agreed, and it's good that this will support development within Huntington. We've had a lot of development in Huntington in the last few years, 3 housing developments, Vanguard, the stadium. So this neighbourhood plan does help us to protect the area that we live in Huntington. It's very important. So I'm happy to support the recommendations that are in the report. Thank you, Chair.
What a fantastic stadium it is, Councillor Orwell. Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of questions about the referendum itself. I guess there's probably a fairly strong view, or is there, that it should be held on the same day as the PFCC election for sort of purposes of, improved turnout and also not creating another kind of election and reason that would sort of draw people to polling stations at this particular time. But does that sort of cause problems with things like postal votes, which presumably will actually be going out fairly swiftly? And just in terms as well, I guess, of the information that will be available to local residents to sort of make up their minds before they actually vote, is that kind of down to the sort of group that produced the plan to sort of, I guess, promote their work and get people to sort of vote positively for it, or is there a kind of general duty or anything on the council to present it? Or
yeah, if I could come in there, I have spoken to our legal services department and also our electoral services department regarding the date, and I also suggested and wondered if it could be on the same date as the police and crime commissioners election. They've suggested that we have it on a separate date. Obviously, I think it's going to be very slightly different this time round with all the coronavirus restrictions, etc. So they wanted to do that one first and see how that ran, and then they wanted to have it on a separate date. That was their recommendation to myself. And the 10th of June is a date that has been put forward for that. In terms of letting local residents know, the neighbourhood plan group or the parish council up to a certain date are allowed to let residents know about the referendum. There are certain notices that we need to produce to put on the website and also onto the parish notice boards. So that is something that we can help with, so the local residents can find out about the referendum. There is a certain date when we can't do any more we can't explain about it anymore. Just it has to be in line with the regulations. But up until a certain date, yes, we can help with letting local residents know.
Councillor Crawshaw.
I think Councillor Hollier had his hand up for a supplementary.
Apologies. I guess only the note. I'm sure there's very good reasons for that timeline that's suggested. But I guess some of the postal votes and things like that that people might have applied for so that they can vote in the PFCC from home might expire soon after. So it might be worth the council, I guess, thinking about how those people could continue to have a postal vote after that election.
Yes, I mean, I can speak to the Electoral Services Department and pick this up with them.
If they're on the ball, we could maybe get an updated executive when it comes there, Anna, if you get them to.
Yes,
that time.
I'll pick it up for Thursday, yes.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. I had a related question actually regarding the referendum, which was just around the cost estimated at 7,000, and my assumption would be that might reduce if it was to happen at the same time as the PFCC elections. I guess what I was just interested in was whether or not the 16,000, nearly 17,000 total cost of this local plan is fairly typical for a local plan, because obviously there's 21 wards in the city, and you know, you add that up and it starts to become quite a big number. But if this is a typical amount, or whether it can vary quite significantly from that.
Yes, if I could respond. Yes, it is a very typical amount. We do actually get a grant from the government for £20,000 once the decision statement is approved by executive. So if this is approved by executive on Thursday, we will be able to apply for a £20,000 grant to cover the cost of the neighbourhood plan.
Thank you. And if I may, Chair, there was just a second point of clarity.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was just in something you said, Anna, in sort of introducing this, and you were saying once it was adopted, the neighbourhood plan would have significant weight in planning terms. And this may be my misunderstanding here, but I had understood that the neighbourhood plans to hold significant weight were also dependent on a local plan being in place, and that until such time as it's in place, it doesn't carry quite the same material weight that it would do. But have I misunderstood that, or could you just clarify?
Yeah, it does hold significant weight, as I understand it, just because of the new coronavirus regulations that have been brought in specifically in relation to neighbourhood plans. In the past, it held significant weight once a referendum date had been agreed, but because obviously referendums hadn't been held in the past year due to the pandemic, new guidance had come out to say that in terms of neighbourhood plans, it does hold significant weight now once the decision statement has been agreed by executives.
Thank you, that's helpful.
If I could just add to that, just on your point about the local plan point, Councillor Crawshaw, in that the preparation of the neighbourhood plan has to be in general conformity with the emerging local plan. So we're satisfied that the preparation of the plan is in conformity and reflects the plan, so that it could be taken forward through the process. And you know, it would form, once the decision is made and it gains significant weight, and once a referendum is held and a decision is made to adopt the plan, it does form part of the development plan for the city.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Doughty.
Thanks. It's just an extension of the question that Councillor Crawshaw has asked, actually, or resulting from the officer answer on it. We'll be all aware that planning applications gone in for around 300 homes between the community stadium and New Lane in Huntington, and what's been said now about the coronavirus element and not being able to potentially having had the referendum already. Will this draft plan offer some potential protection or influence in terms of planning applications in Huntington before the local plan or indeed the neighbourhood plan's adopted?
If I could jump in there to answer that question for you, Councillor Doughty. As Anna said, it gains significant weight. So as of Thursday, when members hopefully decide to take it forward, the plan subsequently gains significant weight in the decision-making process. So any applications that come forward at that point will be able to apply significant weight to the policies in the plan. So it will apply from essentially Friday in terms of decision making, and will be reflecting in any policy response and in any DM response the weight of that plan in our decision making process for development management.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any further questions or comments? Okay, so we have the recommendations at paragraph 2 on page 43. Are we happy to read those? I'm seeing general agreement. Okay, thank you, everyone. You'll be glad to know I have no urgent business. So with that point, I'm happy to declare the meeting closed, and thank you, everyone, for your time.